We are truly delighted that you have chosen to join us and listen to our stories today, and we sincerely hope you find deep resonance within this channel's journey. Before we begin our immersion into the halls of Blackwood Manor, we would love to know more about those who walk this path with us. Where are you watching from? Please, write it in the comments below, for every story is a bridge between distant hearts. In the late Victorian era, silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a carefully tailored garment worn by the elite to hide the fraying edges of their souls. Within the suffocating elegance of the English countryside, Elizabeth moved like a ghost through her own life. A daughter of stone and silk who had mastered the art of being seen without ever being heard. Her presence was a whisper in a room full of shouts, a deliberate withdrawal that left the aristocratic air feeling heavy with the weight of everything she chose not to say. The grand estate of her father, the Lord of Blackwood, was a labyrinth of polished mahogany and cold marble, where every footfall seemed to echo a history of rigid restraint. Elizabeth possessed a beauty that was often described as porcelain, not because of its delicacy, but because of its impenetrable surface, a mask of isolation that protected the flickering flame of her inner world. She watched the world through eyes that had learned to catalog the smallest tremors in a conversation, the way a lip might twitch or a hand might linger too long on a silver spoon. To her, the world was a collection of observations, a vast gallery of human behavior where she remained the sole, unblinking curator. Who among us has not, at some point, felt the safety of a self-imposed fortress, believing that if we do not speak, the world cannot hurt us? Her silence was her sanctuary, a border she had drawn between her fragile spirit and the demanding expectations of a lineage that valued reputation over breath. There is a particular kind of longing that grows in the gaps between unspoken words, a hunger for connection that persists even when the tongue is tied by invisible threads. Elizabeth spent her afternoons in the library, where the smell of old parchment and leather offered a comfort that her father's stern gaze never could. Finding solace in the silent dialogues of long-dead poets, she was a master of the pause, understanding that in the high society of the era, what was omitted was often more lethal than what was explicitly stated. Her restraint was not a lack of will, but an exercise of it, a quiet rebellion against a household that demanded she be a decorative centerpiece rather than a living, feeling woman. She navigated the formal dinners like a navigator through a minefield, her stillness serving as both a shield and a mirror, reflecting the emptiness of the glittering world around her. The isolation she felt was not a lonely island, but a crowded room where no one knew her name, despite the titles and the ancestral portraits that lined the corridors. Every morning, she dressed in layers of lace and corset, a physical manifestation of the structural confinement that governed her every waking hour, feeling the constriction not just in her lungs, but in her very identity. She saw the way the servants whispered in the shadows, their lives vibrant and loud in comparison to the muted, monochromatic existence she shared with her father. It was a life lived in the margins, a story written in invisible ink that only the most patient of observers could ever hope to decipher. Have you ever stood in a crowded room and felt the profound realization that your truest self was completely invisible to those standing right beside you? This was Elizabeth's reality, a perpetual state of waiting for a sound that would finally resonate with the frequency of her own hidden heart. Her father, a man of iron will and terrifyingly precise manners, viewed her silence as a mark of perfect breeding, never suspecting that it was actually a form of internal exile. He moved through the estate with the heavy gravity of a system that brooked no dissent, unaware that his daughter was a silent witness to every crack in his formidable facade. Elizabeth recorded these cracks in the private journal of her mind, noting the way his hand shook when he reached for his brandy, or the hollow ring in his voice when he spoke of family honor. She was the keeper of the house's unvoiced truths, a living vault of secrets that fermented in the stillness of the Victorian air. The tension in the house was a living thing, a coiled spring of expectation that threatened to snap with the slightest intrusion of genuine human emotion. As the seasons shifted, bringing a biting chill to the gardens, a sense of impending change began to permeate the thick velvet curtains of the manor. Elizabeth felt it in the way the wind rattled the window panes, a restless energy that mirrored the growing turbulence within her own chest. A premonition that her carefully guarded silence was about to be challenged. The world was about to expand beyond the iron gates of Blackwood, bringing with it a presence that would not be so easily ignored or observed from a distance. A carriage was already winding its way through the mist-covered lanes, carrying a passenger whose arrival would ripple through the quiet waters of her existence. The stillness of the house held its breath, suspended in that final moment of peace before the first stone is cast into a mirror. Soon, the heavy oak doors would swing open to a stranger who traded in the very words Elizabeth had spent a lifetime suppressing. The arrival of a stranger in a house built on silence is akin to a sudden draft in a room of candle smoke. It does not merely enter, it disturbs the very air that has sat stagnant for years. Nathan came not with the thunder of a conqueror, but with the quiet, unsettling gravity of a man who looked at the world as if it were a manuscript waiting to be edited. As he stepped across the threshold of Blackwood Manor, his coat still carrying the scent of rain and travel, he brought with him an aura of unstudied curiosity that stood in stark contrast to the rigid, performative politeness of the household. Elizabeth watched from the shadows of the upper landing, her fingers tracing the cold vine carvings of the banister, observing how this new presence seemed to occupy space with an ease she had never known. He did not bow to the portraits with the same hollow reverence as the local suitors, but instead looked them in the eye, searching for the humanity behind the oil paint. His function in the house was ostensibly professional, a writer hired to document the family lineage. Yet his presence felt like a gentle invasion of a fortress that had forgotten it was under siege. Lord Blackwood welcomed him with a practiced distance, a handshake that was more a transaction of status than a gesture of warmth. Oblivious to the way Nathan's eyes wandered toward the quiet corners of the room, there was a certain unease that began to settle over the servants. A collective holding of breath as they sensed a pair of eyes among them that were trained to see the things usually left in the dark. Nathan moved with a deliberate slowness, suggesting a man who was comfortable with the pauses in a conversation. To Elizabeth, he was a walking paradox, a man of words entering a realm where words were used primarily as weapons of exclusion or shields of deceit. The first dinner with his presence felt different, the clinking of silver against fine bone china sounding sharper, more aggressive, as if the house itself were trying to drown out the possibility of a new voice. Nathan sat with a posture of relaxed attentiveness, his gaze frequently drifting toward Elizabeth, who remained anchored in her usual seat of silent observation. He did not attempt to force a conversation with her, a rare courtesy that she found both relieving and deeply suspicious, for she was used to men who tried to fill her silence with the sound of their own importance. Instead, he seemed to acknowledge her stillness as a choice rather than a void, a subtle shift in dynamic that made the air between them vibrate with an unspoken recognition. Who among us has not felt that sudden, jarring spark of being truly noticed by a stranger, long before a single word has passed between you? As the days unfolded, Nathan began to weave himself into the fabric of the estate, his notebook becoming a permanent extension of his hand, a white flag of truce in a cold war of social etiquette. He spent hours in the library, the very sanctuary where Elizabeth sought her own refuge. And though they sat in opposite corners, the room felt smaller, the silence shared rather than solitary. He had a way of tilting his head when he listened to the house, as if he could hear the groaning of the floorboards as a narrative of fatigue rather than mere age. Elizabeth found herself watching the way his ink-stained fingers moved across the page, wondering if the stories he wrote were as honest as the curiosity that burned in his expression. The distance between them was measured not in feet, but in the vast, uncharted territories of their private histories. Yet every shared hour in the library felt like a bridge being built in secret. There is a peculiar tension that arises when two observers meet, a silent negotiation of who will be the first to look away, and who will be the first to speak the truth. Nathan's arrival had introduced a new rhythm to Blackwood, a syncopation that disrupted the metronome of her father's rules and brought a flicker of heat to the cold, marble hallways. Elizabeth felt the weight of his attention even when she was not in the room, a sensation of being read like a book whose spine had never been cracked, both terrifying and intoxicating in its novelty. She began to notice the small details of his humanity, the way he forgot to smooth his hair when he was deep in thought, or the faint, genuine smile he gave to the scullery maid, and realized that his politeness was not a mask, but a bridge. It was an unsettling revelation, for it suggested that not everyone in the world used their external self to hide the internal. a concept that threatened to destabilize her entire philosophy of protection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elizabeth realized that the arrival of this man was the end of her life as a mere spectator. The curiosity he brought was a key turning in a lock she had long ago deemed rusted shut, and the unease she felt was the first sign of a heart beginning to thaw under the pressure of being seen. The house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage, and for the first time, she wondered if she was tired of her role in the background. The moon rose over the estate, silvering the path where Nathan walked alone, contemplating the secrets he had already begun to sense beneath the surface of the manor. The first chapter of their shared time was closing, but the ink was still wet, and the next page promised a scrutiny she was not yet sure she could survive. The quiet was no longer a shield, but a curtain about to rise. Subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. For it is through your support that these echoes of the past find their way into the present. The manor had always been a theater of grand gestures, but Nathan possessed the rare ability to find the profound in the infinitesimal, turning his gaze toward the subtle shifts that others dismissed as mere background noise. He spent his mornings not in the center of the drawing room, but in the periphery, noticing the way Elizabeth's hand would tighten almost imperceptibly around a silk handkerchief whenever her father's voice rose in pitch. It was an exercise in empathy, a quiet gathering of evidence that suggested her silence was not a void of thought, but a deliberate containment of a vast, stormy interior. He saw the way she looked at the birds beyond the glass, not with the casual interest of a spectator, but with the raw, aching envy of a prisoner studying the mechanics of flight. The house was a machine of repetition, yet Nathan began to document the ghosts in the gears, the small human errors that revealed the strain of maintaining such a rigid facade of aristocratic perfection. He noticed that the stillness Elizabeth projected was not the restfulness of a pond, but the vibrating tension of a bridge under a weight it was never meant to carry. He watched her in the gardens, observing how she touched the petals of the dying roses with a tenderness that she never afforded herself, as if she were apologizing to the flowers for the inevitable decay of all beautiful things. There is a specific kind of intimacy found in being watched by someone who seeks to understand rather than to judge, a feeling that someone is finally speaking your native tongue in a foreign land. Who has not felt the sudden, terrifying warmth of being truly seen in a moment they thought was private? Elizabeth, in turn, found herself caught in the gravity of his attention, realizing that her invisibility, her greatest weapon, was failing her in the light of his steady, unblinking interest. She saw him noticing the books she left open, the specific passages she had underlined with a faint pencil mark, and she felt a sense of exposure that was more visceral than nakedness. He did not rush to fill the air with empty compliments. Instead, he offered her the gift of shared stillness, sitting nearby as he wrote, creating a pocket of peace that felt entirely separate from the rest of the house. It was a study in detail, a slow-motion collision of two souls who were both experts in the art of the unsaid, each waiting for the other to reveal the first crack in their armor. The air in the library began to feel thick with the weight of these observations, a silent dialogue of glances and shifted postures that spoke more than 1,000 pages of formal prose. There is a quiet dignity in the way some people carry their burdens, a stoicism that demands a specific kind of respect. And Nathan found himself deeply moved by the strength it took for Elizabeth to remain so composed. He saw the empathy in her eyes when a servant stumbled, a flash of shared humanity that was quickly extinguished by the cold requirements of her social station, and he realized she was a woman living in a constant state of internal translation. She was translating her fire into ice, her screams into sighs, and her dreams into the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Have you ever wondered how much energy we spend every single day simply pretending that we are okay, while our internal worlds are quietly collapsing under the pressure? This realization drew him closer to her, not out of pity, but out of a profound recognition of a kindred spirit who had also learned to survive through observation. He began to leave small traces of his presence for her to find. A dried wildflower placed between the pages of a book, or a chair moved just enough to catch the afternoon sun, subtle signals that he was paying attention. These were not loud declarations of affection, but quiet acknowledgments of her existence, a series of micro-connections that began to weave a safety net beneath her feet. Elizabeth found herself seeking out these small alterations, her days becoming a scavenger hunt for the proof that she was no longer alone in her solitude. The isolation that had once been her fortress was beginning to feel like a cage, and the man with the ink-stained fingers was the only one who seemed to hold the key to the gate. It was a dangerous game of awareness, a gradual peeling back of layers that left them both vulnerable to the cold winds of reality that blew through the manor's cracks. As the shadows of the oaks lengthened across the lawn, Nathan made a note in his journal that would change the trajectory of their silent dance, a single sentence that captured the essence of his discovery. He realized that Elizabeth's silence was not a lack of a voice, but a voice that had been forced to speak in a language that the world had forgotten how to hear. The observation was complete, the data had been gathered, and the time for passive watching was drawing to an inevitable close. Replaced by a need for something more substantial, the quiet of the house felt different now. No longer empty, but pregnant with the possibility of a revelation that could no longer be contained within the margins of a notebook. The first thread of their connection had been pulled, and the entire tapestry of Blackwood was beginning to vibrate with the tension of what was to come. Beneath the surface of the manor's polite rituals, a long-buried memory was beginning to stir, threatening to break the very silence it had created. The architecture of a secret is often sturdier than the walls of the house that contains it, built from the mortar of shame and the heavy stones of protection. As Nathan delved deeper into the archives of the estate, he began to realize that Elizabeth's withdrawal was not a natural disposition, but a structural necessity, a scar tissue that had formed over a wound too deep to be viewed by the light of day. He found old ledgers where names had been scratched out with a violence that transcended mere clerical error, and he felt the chill of a trauma that had been frozen in time, preserved by the very coldness of the Victorian etiquette they all performed. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the manor was at its most honest, the echoes of the past seemed to seep through the floorboards like a slow, dark tide. Nathan observed how Elizabeth avoided certain rooms with a precision that was almost mathematical. Her path through the house, a complex map of avoidance designed to keep her from the ghosts of her own childhood. He began to piece together a mosaic of loss. A mother who vanished into the mist of illness, a father whose grief had calcified into a tyrannical need for control, and a young girl who learned that her voice was the only thing she could truly hide. The trauma was not a single event, but a climate, a persistent winter that had settled over her heart before she was old enough to know that spring was an option for others. Who has not carried a memory so heavy that they feared speaking its name would cause the very earth beneath them to give way? There is a particular kind of protection that looks like cruelty from the outside, a way of burying the truth so deep that it can never be heard again, even if the person carrying it suffocates in the process. Nathan saw this in the way Lord Blackwood looked at his daughter, not with love, but with a desperate, fearful vigilance, as if he were guarding a flickering candle in a hurricane. The silence was their shared bunker, a place where they could pretend the world hadn't broken, where the unspoken served as the only currency that still held its value. Elizabeth's wounds were not visible, but they were audible in the way she held her breath when a door slammed, or the way her eyes darted to the exits of every room she entered. She was a survivor of a war that had no official name, fought in the hallways of her own home, where the only victory was remaining unnoticed by the enemy. The memory of the event that had silenced her began to loom in the periphery of Nathan's research, a dark shape beneath the water that he was both terrified and determined to bring to the surface. He found a discarded ribbon in a locked drawer, stained not with blood, but with the yellowing grime of years of neglect, and he felt a surge of protective fury that nearly broke his professional composure. He realized that the household was not a family, but a conspiracy of silence, a group of people who had agreed to live in a lie because the truth was a fire they were not prepared to extinguish. It was a revelation that changed everything. He was no longer just a biographer of a lineage, but a witness to a crime of the spirit. Have you ever looked back at your own family history and realized that the traditions you cherished were actually just the survival mechanisms of people who didn't know how to heal? This realization created a new, sharper tension between Nathan and the environment, a sense that he was walking on thin ice over a very deep and very cold lake. He began to see the protection Elizabeth practiced as a form of self-entombment, a way of staying dead so that she would not have to experience the pain of dying again. Her isolation was a fortress, yes, but it was also a prison, where the walls were made of her own unspoken words and the ceiling was the weight of her father's expectations. Every time their eyes met, Nathan felt the urge to reach out and pull her from the wreckage, but he knew that a voice cannot be given. It must be reclaimed by the one who lost it. The secrets were the ghosts of the manor, and until they were acknowledged, no one in the house would ever truly be allowed to wake up. As the topic of her history became an unspoken presence between them, the atmosphere grew heavy with the electricity of a coming storm, the kind of heat that makes the skin itch with the need for release. Nathan watched Elizabeth standing by the window, the gray light of the moors washing over her face, and he saw for the first time the microscopic trembling of her hands. The facade was cracking, the pressure of the hidden truth pushing against the porcelain surface of her restraint until it hummed. With the threat of a rupture, he knew that the next step would require more than just observation. It would require an act of trust that neither of them was quite ready to perform. The silence was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a countdown, a ticking clock hidden behind the wallpaper of their polite interactions. One letter, hidden where it was never meant to be found, would soon serve as the first crack in the dam. Subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this, as we continue to peel back the layers of a heart that forgot how to speak. In the silent economy of Blackwood Manor, words that could not be spoken were forced to find a new medium, leaking out through the tips of fountain pens and hiding in the folds of discarded parchment. Nathan discovered that Elizabeth had been conducting a secret life on paper, a sprawling, ink-stained cartography of her soul that she hid beneath the loose floorboards of the library. These were not diaries in the traditional sense, but letters addressed to no one and everyone. A desperate broadcast from a sinking ship that hoped the ocean itself might learn to read. He found them by chance, a sliver of white amidst the dark wood. And as he read the first few lines, he felt as though he were finally hearing the true frequency of her voice, stripped of the Victorian static that usually muffled it. The letters were masterpieces of raw, unfiltered human experience, filled with the descriptions of colors she was not allowed to wear and emotions she was not allowed to feel. She wrote of the suffocation of velvet and the loudness of a stair, using metaphors that were so vivid they seemed to pulse with a life of their own under Nathan's touch. Through these unwritten words, she had built a sanctuary of expression that her father could never colonize. A private universe where she was the sovereign of her own narrative. Nathan realized that this was her true voice, a vibrant and courageous thing that had been forced to live underground like a root, waiting for the right season to break through the surface. It was an act of profound bravery, for in an era where a woman's reputation was her only currency, these papers were a confession of her refusal to be erased. There is a sacred trust involved in reading the words someone never intended for your eyes, a feeling of stepping into the inner sanctum of a person's most vulnerable self. Who among us has not, in a moment of intense solitude, written a letter we knew we would never send, just to prove to ourselves that our feelings were real? Nathan felt the weight of this responsibility pressing against his chest, knowing that by holding these papers, he held the very essence of Elizabeth's survival in his ink-stained hands. He did not feel like a voyeur, but like an archaeologist discovering a lost civilization, one that was still very much alive and screaming for air beneath the ruins. He began to understand that her silence was not a wall, but a dam. And these letters were the first trickles of a flood that was beginning to undermine the entire foundation of the estate. The letters spoke of a trust she longed to give but feared to name, a hope that someone might one day walk through the halls of her life and see the person instead of the porcelain. Nathan saw himself reflected in her observations, the man who writes with his heart in his eyes. And the realization made the breath catch in his throat, for it meant she had been observing him as closely as he had been observing her. It was a mutual awakening. A silent pact formed between the lines of her hidden prose, creating a connection that was deeper than any spoken conversation could ever be. He began to respond in the only way he knew how, by leaving his own notes in the margins of the books she loved, a subterranean dialogue that bypassed the watchful eyes of the household. They were two ghosts haunting the same house, finally finding a way to touch without breaking the rules of their haunting. The courage required to express oneself when the world demands silence is a rare and beautiful thing, a flicker of light in a vast and indifferent darkness. Elizabeth's letters were her bridge to the world, a way of reaching out across the void of her isolation to touch a future she wasn't sure she would ever see. Every word she wrote was a victory over the trauma that had tried to steal her breath. A defiant, "I am here," whispered into the ear of history. Nathan felt a shift in his own purpose. He was no longer there to document the dead history of the Blackwood line, but to protect the living story that was fighting to be told. The letters became their secret map, a guide to the hidden passages of her heart that he was now determined to follow to the very end. As he replaced the papers, he noticed one final scrap of parchment that seemed more recent than the others, its edges crisp and its ink dark. It contained only a single question, one that seemed to vibrate with the urgency of a heart that could no longer stand the pressure of its own containment. The question was a challenge to the universe, a plea for a sign that the silence was not a life sentence, but a temporary stay of execution. Elizabeth was standing at the edge of a precipice, her unwritten words finally pushing her toward a choice she could no longer avoid. The air in the library felt thin. The very books on the shelves seemed to lean in, waiting for the answer that only an act of incredible courage could provide. Could a life built on a lie ever survive the introduction of a single, honest word? The facade of a noble house is much like the crust of the earth. It appears solid and eternal until the pressure from beneath becomes too great for the surface to contain. As the unspoken bond between Elizabeth and Nathan deepened, the rigid hierarchy of Blackwood Manor began to show its first true cracks, revealing a structural imbalance that had long been ignored. The servants, once invisible shadows of efficiency, started to move with a palpable sense of unease, their whispers carrying the sharp edge of long-repressed grievances. There was a subtle shift in the way the tea was served, a slight tremor in the hand of the footman, suggesting that the master's control was no longer the absolute law it had once been. The house was breathing differently now, the rhythmic ticking of its many clocks falling out of sync as the weight of decades of secrets began to push against the heavy oak doors. Lord Blackwood himself seemed to sense the change, his authority morphing into a brittle, frantic sort of dominance that left no room for error. He patrolled the halls with a renewed vigor, his eyes searching for a betrayal he couldn't name, unaware that the real rebellion was happening in the silence of his daughter's gaze. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste, a metallic tang of impending rain that kept everyone in a state of perpetual low-level alarm. Have you ever stood in a room where the air was so heavy with unspoken truth that you felt you might choke if someone didn't finally scream? The imbalance was no longer a private burden for Elizabeth. It had become the atmosphere of the entire estate. Behind the polished silver and the multi-course meals lay a history of control that had systematically eroded the joy from every soul under that roof. Nathan observed the cook's weary eyes and the gardener's bowed shoulders, seeing them not as workers, but as victims of the same emotional famine that had nearly starved Elizabeth. The control exerted by the Lord was a fragile thing, dependent entirely on everyone's willingness to play their part in his grand unhollow play. But as the writer and the daughter shared their silent understandings, the script began to blur, and the actors started to forget their lines. The facade was failing because the people behind it were tired of the cost of maintenance, finding that the price of honor was far too high when paid in the currency of their own happiness. The imbalance of power was most visible in the library, where the dust motes seemed to dance with a chaotic energy that defied the orderly rows of books. Elizabeth noticed the way the housemaids lingered a second longer than necessary, their eyes darting toward her with a mixture of curiosity and hope, as if sensing that she was the key to their own liberation. Who among us hasn't felt that terrifying moment when the way things have always been suddenly feels like an unbearable lie? One evening, a glass shattered in the dining room, a trivial accident that, in any other house, would have been laughed away. But here, it felt like a gunshot. The silence that followed was not the respectful hush of the elite, but the terrified stillness of a prey animal, as Lord Blackwood's face turned a shade of crimson that bordered on the monstrous. In that moment, the imbalance was exposed for what it truly was, a system of fear that relied on the smallness of others to feel large. Elizabeth didn't look down at her plate this time. She looked at the broken shards on the rug and then directly at her father, her eyes holding a clarity that was more devastating than any shout. The spell was broken, and though the pieces were swept away, the memory of the rupture remained, a jagged line through the heart of the household. As the night deepened, the house felt less like a manor and more like a ruin waiting for the wind to finish what the seasons had started. Nathan sat in his room, listening to the creaks of the settling timber, realizing that the household had been unearthed not by a grand gesture, but by the slow, persistent growth of a single truth. The secrets were no longer buried. They were rising, pushing through the floorboards like weeds in a neglected garden, demanding to be seen. The control was slipping through the Lord's fingers like dry sand, and the more he tried to clench his fist, the faster it disappeared. The stage was set for a confrontation that had been decades in the making, and the air was cold with the promise of a winter that would not leave until everything had been laid bare. The weight of the house was now resting entirely on the thin shoulders of a woman who had finally decided she was strong enough to let it fall. Subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. For every soul deserves to find the key to its own hidden chambers. In the heart of Blackwood Manor, there was a room that was never opened, a space where the air had been trapped since the day the music stopped. And it was here that the true source of Elizabeth's silence resided. Nathan found her standing before the heavy oak door, her hand hovering inches from the handle, trembling with the weight of a decade's worth of repressed terror. It was not a physical lock that kept her out, but a psychological barricade, a memory of a day when the truth had been deemed too dangerous for a child to carry. The stillness in the corridor was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very breath from the lungs, leaving only the cold, hard reality of a voice that had been forcibly interred. The confession did not come in a rush of words, but in the slow, agonizing surrender of her posture as she finally leaned her forehead against the wood. Through the letters he had found and the subtle language of her gestures, the story began to assemble itself in Nathan's mind. A moment of accidental witness, a mother's desperate plea, and a father's hand descending like a shadow to command her to forget. She had seen the fracture in her parents' union, the secret betrayal that had led to her mother's exile, and she had been told that her words were the poison that would kill her family name. To protect those she loved, or perhaps to survive the man she feared, she had turned the key on her own throat, believing that if she never spoke, the tragedy could be contained. Who among us has not traded a piece of their soul for the illusion of safety, only to find the cost was higher than the life they were trying to save? The vulnerability in that hallway was a living thing, a raw nerve exposed to the biting air of the Victorian winter. Elizabeth's eyes, usually so guarded and reflective, were now wide with the pain of 1,000 suppressed cries, looking at Nathan as if he were the only solid thing in a world made of ghosts. She was showing him the wound, not for pity, but for the sake of truth, a silent testimony to the fact that her isolation had been an act of sacrificial love. The voice she had locked away was not gone. It was merely waiting, a bird in a darkened cage that had forgotten how the sun felt on its wings. It was a moment of profound revelation, where the porcelain girl finally shattered to reveal the breathing, aching woman beneath the glaze. The trauma had shaped the very architecture of her mind, creating a labyrinth of don'ts and mustn'ts that governed her every interaction with the world. Nathan realized that every silence he had observed was a brick in this wall, a desperate effort to maintain the vacuum she had lived in since she was 7 years old. He saw the scars of the psychological restraint she had practiced, the way her body tensed at the mere thought of a direct question, fearing that any opening would lead to a total collapse. It was a devastating realization. She had been the curator of her own prison, fueled by a distorted sense of duty to a man who had never deserved her loyalty. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a secret that wasn't even yours to keep? Yet you carried it until your spine began to bend under the pressure? As they stood there, the distance between them evaporated, replaced by a shared understanding that transcended the need for speech. Nathan did not try to force the door open, nor did he demand she speak her truth aloud. He simply stood as a witness to her pain, offering the steadying presence of a man who was not afraid of the dark. This was the release she had been waiting for, not a loud proclamation, but the simple, quiet acknowledgement that her suffering was real and that she was no longer alone in the dark. The lock on her voice was beginning to rust, the pins falling into place as she allowed herself to feel the full gravity of her own history. The air in the corridor felt warmer, the frost on the windows beginning to weep as the internal temperature of the house finally began to rise. But the act of unlocking a voice is not without its dangers, for once the door is opened, the contents of the room can no longer be controlled. The truth Elizabeth carried was a fire that had been smoldering in a room without oxygen. And the moment she invited Nathan in, she was letting in the air that would cause it to erupt. The peace of the manor was a fragile lie, and the tremors of her awakening were already being felt in the master's study at the end of the hall. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was a physical necessity, a reckoning that would either set her free or bury them both in the ashes of the Blackwood name. The shadow at the end of the corridor was no longer a ghost, but her father, watching the light from the open door with eyes of cold, calculating fury. The eruption of a long-suppressed truth is rarely a tidy affair. Lord Blackwood did not approach with a shout, but with a silence that was far more lethal. A cold, predatory stillness that seemed to suck the warmth from the corridor as he moved toward the unlocked door. His presence was the embodiment of a system that demanded total erasure of the self in favor of the image, and seeing Nathan standing beside his daughter was, to him, the ultimate breach of a sacred, suffocating contract. He looked at Elizabeth not as a father looks at a child in pain, but as a warden looks at a prisoner who has finally found the courage to touch the bars. The air became a conductor for the electric hostility radiating from his frame. A tension so thick it felt as though the very walls were leaning in to witness the inevitable collapse. There is a specific kind of terror that accompanies the moment a hidden truth is dragged into the light. A feeling of being flayed by the gaze of those who would rather you remain a lie. Lord Blackwood's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a low rasp of disappointment, a weapon designed to make Elizabeth feel small, insignificant, and inherently broken. He spoke not to her, but at her, addressing the shame of her curiosity and the betrayal of her sudden, visible spirit, as if her desire to breathe were a personal insult to his lineage. He attempted to exert the old gravity, the heavy hand of authority that had kept her mute for a decade. But for the first time, the pull of his orbit failed to ground her. Who among us has not faced a moment where a person we once feared suddenly appears fragile, their power revealed to be nothing more than a loud, hollow echo of their own insecurities? Nathan stepped forward, not as a protagonist in someone else's drama, but as a steadying anchor in a sea of emotional debris, his presence a silent refusal to let Elizabeth be swallowed by her father's darkness. The writer saw the Lord for what he truly was, a man terrified of his own reflection, a gardener who had spent his life pruning the flowers of his family until only the thorns remained. The confrontation was not a battle of words, for Elizabeth still lacked the tongue for a verbal war, but it was a battle of presence, a confrontation of the soul. She stood her ground, her feet planted on the floorboards that hid her secrets, her eyes refusing to drop to the rug in the customary gesture of submission. The exposure was total. The mask of the porcelain daughter had fallen away, leaving behind a woman whose very existence was a rebellion against the man before her. The reckoning was not merely about the secret in the room, but about the decades of airless dinners, the stolen glances, and the systematic theft of a young woman's identity. Lord Blackwood's fury began to crack, revealing the desperation of a man who realized that fear is a currency that eventually loses its value if the subject no longer cares to survive. He reached out to close the door to lock the secret away once more, but Elizabeth placed her hand upon the wood, a simple gesture of resistance that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken protests. In that touch, the hierarchy of the house was permanently inverted. The master was no longer in control, and the silent girl was no longer a victim. Have you ever reached the limit of your own endurance and found that, in the moment of total rupture, you were actually more powerful than you had ever dared to imagine? The exposure of his cruelty did not lead to an apology, for men built of stone do not know how to bend. Instead, it led to a terrifying clarity, a realization that the family name was a shroud they were all wearing while still alive. The air in the hallway felt thin, the light from the opened room spilling out like a golden wound across the dark carpet, illuminating the dust of a history that was finally being disturbed. There was no going back to the way things were. The peace of Blackwood Manor was a corpse that could no more be revived than the mother who had been driven from its halls. As the echoes of the Lord's final, bitter command died away, a new kind of silence settled over the corridor, not the silence of repression, but the silence that follows a great explosion, when the smoke is still clearing and the survivors are beginning to count the cost. Elizabeth looked at the man who had been her jailer and saw only a stranger, a realization that was both devastating and profoundly liberating. The confrontation had not ended in a resolution, but in a definitive break, a shattering of the glass that had kept her heart in a vacuum for so long. The truth was out, raw and bleeding, and the house itself seemed to groan under the weight of the sudden, unbearable honesty. The next breath she took would be the first one that belonged entirely to her. The fire had started, and the only thing left to do was decide what was worth saving from the flames. Subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. For every voice that rises from the depths is a victory for us all. The transition from a lifetime of stillness to the first tremor of expression is not a gentle dawn, but a violent birth of the self. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Elizabeth felt the invisible bonds around her throat finally snap, not with a roar, but with the steady, rhythmic pulse of her own blood, returning to limbs that had been frozen for years. The house seemed to vibrate with the frequency of her awakening, the very molecules of the air rearranging themselves to accommodate a presence that was no longer willing to be a ghost. She stood in the center of the library, the light of the setting sun catching the ink stains on her fingers, and for the first time, she did not look for a place to hide. She looked for a way to begin. The first sound she made was a low, fractured thing, a breath that carried the weight of a decade's worth of unvoiced thoughts, a vibration that felt like tectonic plates finally shifting into place. It was the sound of a prisoner stepping into the light, the agonizingly beautiful friction of the soul meeting the world without a filter. Nathan watched from a respectful distance, understanding that this was a sacred alchemy, the moment where trauma is distilled into truth. She began to speak not in sentences, but in fragments of memory and color, each syllable a stone cast into the stagnant pool of her father's legacy. Who among us has not felt the terrifying ecstasy of finally saying the one thing we were told would destroy us, only to find that it was the only thing that could save us? The liberation was not merely auditory, it was a physical emergence, a shedding of the Victorian corset that had restricted her spirit far more than her ribs. She moved through the rooms she once feared, her footsteps no longer apologetic but intentional, reclaiming the space that had been used to diminish her. The servants watched in a trance of disbelief as the silent daughter became a woman of presence, her eyes no longer mirrors but windows into a vast, unfolding landscape. Every word she uttered was a brick removed from the wall, a systematic dismantling of the prison her father had built in the name of protection. There is a profound courage in the act of being seen when you have spent your life perfecting the art of the shadow. Elizabeth's voice was not polished or elegant. It was raw, honest, and heavy with the salt of tears that had never been allowed to fall. Yet it was the most melodic sound Nathan had ever heard. She was no longer a character in her father's tragedy, but the author of her own unfolding epic, writing her existence into the margins of a history that had tried to erase her. Have you ever realized that the weakness you were shamed for was actually the wellspring of your greatest strength, waiting for the right moment to overflow? The emergence of her selfhood was a reckoning for the entire estate, a signal that the old world was dying, and something unscripted was taking its place. Lord Blackwood retreated into the shadows of his study, a man defeated not by an enemy, but by the simple, undeniable fact of his daughter's humanity. The power he had wielded was a vacuum, and now that the room was full of breath, there was no place left for his cold, airless authority to reside. Elizabeth was no longer afraid of the shadows, for she had become the light that defined them, a sovereign entity who had survived the worst the silence could do and come out with her heart intact. The release was total, a tidal wave of becoming that washed away the dust of 1,000 polite deceptions. As the moon rose over the moors, Elizabeth stood on the terrace, the wind catching her hair and pulling it free from the rigid pins of her station. She looked out at the horizon, no longer as a spectator of a life she couldn't touch, but as a traveler preparing for a journey into the unknown. The silence had broken, and in its place was a symphony of possibilities, a cacophony of could and will that drowned out the ghosts of mustn't. The air was cold, but she felt a heat in her chest that no winter could touch, a fire fueled by the very words she had once tried to bury. The story of the silent daughter was over, and the story of the woman was just beginning to find its rhythm. The morning light would bring a new world, but first, she had to navigate the final, silver hours of the night. The dawn that broke over the jagged horizon of the moors did not carry the pale, apologetic light of the previous season. It arrived with a searing clarity, an amber glow that seemed to wash the very stones of Blackwood Manor clean of their history. Elizabeth stood in the entrance hall, her traveling cloak a deep, defiant velvet, feeling the weight of the house no longer as a burden on her shoulders, but as a shell that she had finally outgrown. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth and beginningless, a fragrance that spoke of the world beyond the iron gates where paths were not paved with expectations, but with the dust of genuine choices. She felt a profound stillness within her, not the hollow quiet of a tomb, but the expectant silence of a blank page, vibrating with the potential of 1,000 unwritten sentences. Every breath was a new discovery, a testament to the resilience of a spirit that had learned to sing in a vacuum. Beside her, Nathan held the heavy oak door open, the morning light catching the ink stains on his fingers, a physical reminder of the bridge they had built through the darkest corridors of the soul. He did not lead her out, for he understood that her journey required her to cross the threshold of her own volition, moving from the known misery into the magnificent uncertainty of the light. There was no need for grand declarations or dramatic farewells. The bond between them was a lived truth, a story that had moved beyond the need for a narrator to become a pulse they both shared. They were both travelers now, leaving behind the rigid architecture of a dying era, to seek a landscape where the heart's vernacular was the only language that mattered. Who among us has not stood at the edge of a great change, terrified and exhilarated, knowing that to stay is to die, and to leave is to finally be born? The house remained behind them, a monument to a silence that had finally lost its grip, its windows reflecting the rising sun like eyes that had finally learned to blink. Lord Blackwood did not appear at the landing, for his power had been a creature of the shadows, and in the presence of such uncompromising light, he had simply ceased to be the center of the universe. Elizabeth felt a strange, detached compassion for the man who had tried to preserve her as a statue, realizing that his cruelty was merely a symptom of his own profound fear of the world's messy, beautiful complexity. She was leaving him his silence, but she was taking her voice with her, a fair exchange for a decade of stolen breath and suppressed dreams. It was a moment of renewal, a shedding of the old skin that left her feeling raw, sensitive, and more alive than she had ever dared to imagine. As the carriage began its slow descent down the winding drive, Elizabeth looked back one final time, seeing the manor not as a fortress, but as a nursery where her strength had been forged in the dark. She realized that every year of restraint had been a period of intense, internal growth, a preparation for the life of radical honesty she was about to embrace with both hands. The possibility of the future was a vast, shimmering ocean, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of the depth or the distance from the shore. She began to speak to Nathan, her voice growing stronger with every word, a steady stream of observations and reflections that filled the small space of the carriage with the warmth of a human soul. Have you ever felt the incredible lightness that comes when you finally stop carrying the versions of yourself that were created by other people? The story of the silent daughter was dissolving into the mist, replaced by the emergence of a woman who knew that her words were the most precious currency she possessed. They spoke of the cities they would visit, the books they would write together, and the simple, quiet peace of a home where every door would remain unlocked and every thought would find a welcome ear. The imbalance of the past was being corrected by the steady hand of their shared purpose, creating a narrative that was no longer about survival, but about the exquisite art of becoming. It was a transformation that felt both ancient and entirely new, a repetition of the eternal human cycle of death and rebirth that occurs every time a secret is traded for a truth. The road ahead was long and unfamiliar, but the map was written in the ink of her own heart, and for Elizabeth that was more than enough. The carriage reached the iron gates, which stood open for the first time in memory, allowing them to pass through into the untamed beauty of the English countryside. The looping path of her life had brought her back to the beginning, but she was returning as a different person, a traveler who had seen the center of the labyrinth and found her way out. The story was not concluding, It was merely shifting its focus, preparing the reader for a chapter where the silence would be a choice rather than a cage. As the manor faded into the distance, a single bird rose from the heather, its wings catching the gold of the sun as it ascended into the infinite blue of the morning sky. The journey was just beginning, and the air was filled with the sound of 1,000 possibilities yet to be named. The page turns, and the ink is still wet, waiting for the first word of the next chapter. We have reached the end of this journey through the halls of Blackwood. If you felt the resonance of Elizabeth's voice, please leave a comment telling us which part of her awakening touched you the most. Your engagement helps these stories find their way to more hearts. Until next time.